Our next speaker is Dr. Robin Hsiung, and he is going to talk about some of the news headlines over the last year. And he already gave you a couple of hints about the kinds of topics that he would be covering. Dr. Hsiung.
All right. Is this on? Yes, it is on, because I need extra support. My voice is not very loud. Anyway, we are running late, so I have to go through it very quickly. My task is to go through some of the headlines on the news over the past year. But when I got through them, there were actually so many that I have to reduce to half a year and then only pick the one that is more relevant to what we do every day, because there are many, many news items. So the first one, it says, scientists create the first drug to halt Alzheimer's disease. It was in the UK Times on July 28th, and that was actually the day that we were at an AAIC meeting with an abstract presented. So with that headline, what do you think? Yes, I don't know how to make it appear. So I'll have to escape and see. Okay. So maybe C or maybe D. Okay, or maybe number 3, number 4. So whether we can slow down Alzheimer's disease or maybe it's just a headline to catch your attention. So let's go back here. So this is actually referring to the tau-RX study. So David kind of mentioned that other than the amyloid, the other pathology in the brain in Alzheimer's disease is tau. And in the abstract that was presented during the meeting, they showed us these findings. Let's see if the pointer works. Okay, so overall, looking at the control group, which is the blue line, and then the treatment group at 2 different doses, they're basically overlapping. So there's really no significant differences between the 2 groups. But when you look at this other line, there are some people that are quite stable and they haven't dropped as the other controls in the treatment. And these are the people who were taking the study treatment as a monotherapy, meaning that they haven't got any other medications.
This also is a pointer.
Oh, yes. Okay, I can use a pointer here. Okay. So based on this, some of the people in that study interpreted as potentially, if you don't combine it with another medication, it may be stabilizing the disease. Of course, for many other people in the room, we were also questioning, because in a randomized study, people should know what they're taking, and why are some people taking a treatment, which is usually the cholinesterase inhibitor. And if you take a cholinesterase inhibitor, then there's really no benefit. They are the same as the control group. But if you're not taking a cholinesterase inhibitor, and then you're on the study, why would those people be better? And then the company that made the drug came up with the idea that maybe there's some interaction and then it's canceling out the effect. So at least that's what they told or discussed in the meeting and led to that headline. But a few months later, the actual publication came out. So the first 2 is what they presented initially, but now you get the rest of the information. And if you look at the control group, the blue line are also separated. So the control group is actually a very low dose of that tau-RX medication, because there's no way to mask people from not letting them know that they're not taking a medication. So they have to give them a low dose in order to turn their urine blue so that they know that they're taking something. But when you give them the control condition in the monotherapy versus those who are on a cholinesterase inhibitor, then they are also different. So from our interpretation. It really means that fundamentally, when you're not randomizing people to take the medication with or without the drug, then those people are already different in the baseline. I would imagine that people who are on the cholinesterase inhibitor are probably a little bit worse off in the beginning, and that's why they were treated with the cholinesterase inhibitor, and then they were randomized to receive the treatment. Whereas those people who were not on the cholinesterase inhibitor were probably a little bit better, and that's why they didn't need the medication at first, and then they were just randomized to the study. So if you compare this group to this group, there's really no difference. And when you compare this group to this group, then there's really no difference. So there's a new term that came out in the news that is called alternative fact. In science, there's no alternative fact. They did not present us alternative fact. They present us fact. They can have different interpretation and opinion about the interpretation of the finding. So that's okay in science. We can go into argument and see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. But that is at least how that led to the headline. That isn't exactly what that headline meant. So there was another similar headline that came out a month later. So it's about a different drug that we kind of talk about, but I'm not going to tell you. But which one do you think it means now? Oh. So how do I make... Read the 4 choices. Oh, for 4 choices. We may now cure Alzheimer's disease as A. We may now stop Alzheimer's disease as B. We may now slow down Alzheimer's disease as 3. And it's just another hoax to catch your attention or the investor's attention.
You read the headline. They can't see the headline.
Oh, okay. But there's no way to make the vote appear. So let's see what's the vote is. Oh, okay. Well, it doesn't matter.
Number 4, is it?
Well, this time is actually better. This one refers to the aducanumab study, which Håkon kind of mentioned already. So in this study, it was a phase 1 study, and they actually did show quite significant differences comparing to different doses from the placebo, which is a fake drug. There's really no change in the amyloid binding in the brain. And then with a higher and higher dose, there is actually less and less amyloid binding after 1 year compared to their baseline. And the interesting thing is that based on the cognitive assessment, this one is the amyloid binding, and this one is the CDR, which is a measure of how we assess patients with memory function. And there's also a separation. They just combined all the placebo and all the treatment together. But the treatment group does have a significant benefit. So other than the brain binding, there's also functional improvement, or at least slowing down of the decline based on that study. But there are also some caveats. This is a relatively small sample, about 30 patients per group in the different doses and the placebo. And some of the clinical trial statisticians looking at very detailed assessment on how they did the study is that they have to pull all the controls group together because they are not actually done at the same time. They were actually doing very small parallel group studies at many different times. The first one is the low dose, and then the medium dose, and then the high dose. And the statistician argued that if you do them at different times and then pool them, their statistics may actually adjust it so that the controls group have a little bit less variation. And then at the end, when you have less variation in the group, then the difference is going to be bigger. But at least we do see the data. There does seem to be a difference. Now that the paper is published, we also look at the number of dropouts. And we know that based on the publication, the placebo group and the low dose have very little dropout, and also very little dropout in the early MCI group. But in the high dose, in the Alzheimer's group, there is a large dropout. About 50% of the people drop out in the high dose who are in more severe stages. So when you have differential dropout, presumably all the people who are doing poorly are not in the study anymore. And if you take that out, could that kind of bias the finding a little bit to make the people who are staying in the study look better? That may be the case, but we don't know that until we actually do a much larger scale study, and that's where we're going now. So I am not a PET specialist, but talking to some of the PET imaging people, the imaging finding almost look too good to be true. And they have some questions. Could it be that the circulating drug, the aducanumab, because it binds amyloid, if it somehow bind to the amyloid that is floating around, could it also bind to the target, which is binding the amyloid PET scan in the brain to show the target? Could that also be showing the changes in the brain? That I don't know, and we probably need more studies to confirm that. But these are some of the questions that are raised. But in any case, we're still very cautiously optimistic to go ahead with this study, and we're trying to recruit people to participate in it. So another headline that came out later in the year is about another study, which Håkon already mentioned. It's one of the drug that we're working on called solanezumab. And the context is that there's some previous randomized control study suggesting that although the total effect is negative, but if they combine it with the open label extension, then there's some changes in the curve of the decline, and they take that as a potential meaning for modifying disease. So there's a large study that went on as the phase 3 Expedition 3 study. And we already talked about how A-beta come about as a monomer and stick together as an oligomer, and then eventually they become fibrillar amyloid. And all these MABs, all these monoclonal antibody, bind a slightly different combination. Some of them are more fibrillar, some of them are more monomer. And Neil already mentioned that probably the most toxic form is the intermediate, is the oligomer, before they stick together, but when they're single or when they're becoming a plaque, is actually not so bad. So how much of these antibodies are binding to this form, we don't really know, because it's actually technically very hard to measure. But Dr. Cashman could have given you a lot of details, but that would take another hour. Anyway, but we know that some of these do bind, so which one binds the best, we don't know. So we will need empirical data to actually study that. But I don't have the details, but it was released in a news output that at least the solanezumab does not seem to reach statistical significance. But we are still doing the study in some other population. And one of them, Håkon mentioned, is the Diane study, and the other one is the A4 study, in which these are people who are not having dementia, but they just have a risk of developing dementia. So they are in a very early phase, and so they're actually a different population. As Marie used the burning stove, these are patients who are just starting to have a burning pan, and if we can stop the fire at that time, maybe we can stop the whole house from burning down. I know I'm running out of time and always terrible with that, but I'll go through the next few very quickly. So a headline that came up is preventing Alzheimer's may start with your plate. And I'm not going to wait for you to answer all the questions, but which one is not part of the Mediterranean diet. And C is not working, but maybe just by raise of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So most of you know coconut oil is in the tropics. And actually, coffee and wine are included in the Mediterranean diet. But and which one is not a legume? 1, licorice. 2, peanut. 3, walnut. 4, alfalfa. 5, chickpeas. It's actually walnut. It's not a legume. Anyway, I won't go into botany details. But what was related to that study is that there are many studies suggesting that a Mediterranean diet actually has some benefit to cognition. And that diet includes a large amount of fruit and vegetables, legumes and cereals, maybe a little bit of fat more from olive oil and fish, and some wine and coffee, not too much, maybe 1 drink or 2 drinks a day, and a very small amount of red meat and poultry, and that's about 1 to 2 portions a week. So you can have some, but not too much. And this particular study is associated with brain volumes and adherence to the Mediterranean diet. And I'm running out of time. Lynn is standing right here. I won't go into the details, but it's a cohort done in Scotland. But they measured brain changes in a cohort and then measure how close they are to the diet. And it found that the closer they are to the diet, you can actually slow down brain atrophy. The strength is not very strong, but if taken on the context of things, any benefit is better than no benefit. Related to diet is a probiotic. There's one headline that came out in the Telegraph in the news, and that is based on a very small study on probiotic. It's only 30 people per group, and the probiotic they give people is milk products, which contain lactobacillus versus diet. It's small, but what they found is that these people actually have some increase in the MMSE after 12 weeks if you take the probiotic diet. It's a very small study, but what is intriguing is that the inflammatory index also come down with the probiotic diet. Of course, it's a small study and it has to be replicated in much larger detail to know if it's true or not. And someone asked about the gut-brain connection to Alzheimer's. This was in the headline news, not related to Alzheimer's, but to Parkinson's. But it's a very interesting study looking at mouse model. If you have a mouse that become Parkinson's with a usual diet, that is the control condition. But in the mouse that you give them in a very clean environment with none of the usual gut bacteria, these transgenic mouse actually don't develop Parkinson's disease. And then when you give them stool, you can transplant stool in a mouse. But if you give the stool of a Parkinson's patient to these mouse, the Parkinson's actually get worse. So it's very intriguing that perhaps the immune system and somehow your diet can actually modify disease presentation. We don't have those data in Alzheimer's disease, but we're starting to look at it in some studies. Finally, one last hot headline is that a costly drug for fatal muscular disease wins FDA approval. Is in the New York Times. It's not directly related to Alzheimer's, but the mechanism of treatment, an antisense oligonucleotide, is a new way to modify genetic expression. So it has a very close connection to a lot of the genetic diseases, Huntington's, Alzheimer's, and frontotemporal dementia. And we are actually we know that those companies are now starting to use that technique to treat these different diseases. but the cost is about $375,000 per year. So it's food for thought. It may be a great treatment, but it's also going to be very expensive. Are we able to afford it? And how do we deal with that? And that's something to think about. So what should we take away from this? 1, drink more wine. 2, read the small prints after the headlines and check your sources. Eat more yogurt, buy Biogen stocks, or drink more coffee. So a little bit of wine and coffee is okay, but I want to point out that the Italian drink espresso, not the double tall latte. So it's a very small amount of coffee and not a lot of milk or cream. And when you have the headlines, read the rest of the story and be careful of alternative facts and doublespeak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. Recommendations for nutrition and for the stock market.